Okay, Inside Israel, episode 72 going live in three, two, one. Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff, coming to you from Ra'anana, outside of Tel Aviv. It is episode 72, and the title is Mailbag and Where Do I Stand? Actually, the title is Mailbag and Where Do We Stand? Meaning, where do we stand right now in Israel? There's a lot of confusing stuff happening here in Israel. And I'm going to get to that. I want to set you straight as much as I can with regards to what is actually happening with hostage talks, with ceasefire, with extensions. We have Ramadan happening now, Passover coming up. What does that all amount to for us here in Israel? And the reason it's called Mailbag is because I'm really behind on your emails. So many of you are writing in with comments and questions, and I want to dedicate today's episode to actually answering as many of those as I can. Now, unfortunately, as you're going to see, a lot of these questions don't have straightforward answers because it's such a confusing time, because it's just a vague era in general that we are in right now, where the public is feeling one thing, the government is behaving in another, contrary to what most of the public wants. And so a lot of us just feel caught, and there really is no end game in sight. So I'll do my best to answer your questions, but at the same time, I can't promise extremely straightforward answers. Before we get into it, I do want to give you a little update as to what I personally have been up to. I've been filling you in on my comedy journey, doing stand up here in Israel. And so here's the skinny. Here's what's going on. Lately, I've been going out to comedy rooms several times a week. I've been to about 8 or 9 shows so far, really trying to figure out. First and foremost, what it means to connect with an Israeli audience. Every comedian has a different approach to doing shows, to what comedy means to him or her. For me, the number one thing about stand up comedy is the connection with the audience. I really believe that if you can connect with the audience early in the act, the first 1 minute, then you can pretty much go anywhere you want in the show itself. The audience will go with you. So, what I'm paying attention to is what are the best ways to connect to an Israeli audience. And I think the number one takeaway that I've sort of walked away with from all of these comedy rooms so far is that living in Israel really is a very shared experience. And that's very different than life in the US. A comedian will go to a city in the US, St. Louis, Houston, Miami, whatever, and he or she will need to get to know that city a little bit, try to find some local humor. What I found is that here in Israel, all humor is local. You'll have comedians getting up on stage talking about Kvish HaChof, the coastline road, because everyone in Israel has driven on Kvish HaChof. Everyone knows what it's like. Everyone knows what's difficult about it, what's great about it. Every experience is common. There's really nothing that only belongs to certain segments of the population. And sure, you do have little niche topics. Yemenite families behave differently than Ashkenazi families, etc. And Tel Avivians certainly live. We live in our own bubble here in the center. But overall, life in Israel is very much a shared experience. And I think that's good for the comedian who's looking to connect to the audience, because that means there are so many opportunities to form that connection. So that's really my number one takeaway so far from having been out and about in the Israeli comedy scene, watching all of these shows. Other little big news this week, I filmed a television commercial for a pretty big Israeli optical company. I'm not allowed by contract to say what the name of the company is, but it's pretty well known here in Israel. It was a great role. An agent reached out to me, thought I would be good for the role, and had to audition on tape, booked it, played the role of get this, the sexy optometrist, obviously. So we filmed that a couple days ago, and it was both a very Israeli experience and a very professional one. I mean, I find that Israeli show business actually is quite professional. This is not my first time on an Israeli film set, and I was impressed with how well run the operation was. Lots of cameras, lighting, a stage that was built and then struck, and a new stage set built for the second half of the commercial. Actors, we were all really taken care of. Great catering. Really, easy to follow chain of command in terms of the production crew, the director, the second director, etc. At the same time, it was also very Israeli, and what I mean by that, it was the relationships between people was very informal, very casual. Actors were not stars. We interacted with the crew as if they were buddies. Everyone was on a first name basis. No one was a diva, and I just that strikes me as very Israeli. That sort of leveling, where everyone is sort of on the same plane. So I had a great time. Pay was excellent, and the commercial will start running in mid to late March. I'll put something up on YouTube and on Instagram so you guys can see the actual footage of the commercial if you don't live here in Israel yourselves. All right, let's get on to some questions that you guys have been sending in over the past few weeks. Harold wrote in. He said, I'm having a very difficult time when it comes to the ratio of Israeli hostages released in exchange for Palestinian prisoners who are released. We're talking about Israeli hostages, many of them who have been brutally murdered. They're not even alive. At the same time, we're giving up a huge number of living terrorists that have murdered Israelis. How or why is this even acceptable? Harold asks. And this is a great example of a question that doesn't have a really great answer. Let me tell you, Harold, this is what all of Israel is talking about. We simply, when these Saturdays have been coming around, and that's the day of the week, typically when the hostages have been released, we always feel this amazing wave of joy and excitement. But there's also this other part of us that is in shock when we see the footage from the West Bank or from Gaza of the prisoners being released back in their societies. And we almost can't believe that we're doing this over and over. And like you said, it's not just attempted terrorists, these are terrorists who have, in many cases, brutally murdered multiple Israelis in horrific attacks. So why is this acceptable? I wouldn't necessarily say it's acceptable. It's not. But why is it being done? And I really feel the only answer is we don't feel we have a choice. We're at a point where, for better or worse, and it's definitely for worse, Hamas has leverage over us. They have leverage over us with these Khatufim, with the hostages. It means that we are at their mercy to an extent in terms of what we need to do to get the hostages out. And those who are negotiating on our behalf felt that this was the only way to get hostages, specifically living hostages, still out of Gaza. We're doing it because we have no other choice. That's my point. It's certainly not plan A. But because Hamas has hostages, they have leverage over us. And it sometimes leads to horrific choices on our part. And one of those choices is whether or not to give up murderers of Jews. And we are. We really value life. We really value the lives of our fellow Israeli citizens. And so we will do, on the one hand, whatever it takes to get them out. Now, I must say, our government doesn't always agree with us. Most Israelis would welcome an end to the war, would welcome the IDF pulling out of Gaza in exchange for getting all hostages out right now. The government is not willing to do that. So there still are limits to what will be done. But in terms of why we're letting these prisoners go, the ones who've killed Israelis, murdered Israelis, it's because we feel we don't have a choice. It's as simple as that. I got a letter from Stuart in Connecticut. And Stewart was actually sharing a letter to the editor that he wrote to his local paper. This was in response to the whole idea of these 350 Jewish rabbis and celebrities taking out an ad in the New York Times, pretty much saying that they're against the idea of ethnic cleansing in Gaza and population transfer of Gazans out of Gaza. And I came out very strongly against that ad in the New York Times, saying that although maybe it's not a perfect plan or even a respectable plan, that we need to argue amongst ourselves about it and not air our dirty laundry in public. And I'll just read you a short excerpt from the letter that Stewart wrote to his local paper about this. Stewart wrote, "Recently, 350 Jewish people signed an ad in the New York Times attacking President Trump's ideas for peace in the Middle East. Since 1948, when the United Nations gave Jews and Arabs in Palestine the opportunity to each have their own state, the Arabs, including Palestinian Arabs, have rejected such a two-state solution every time. As recently as 2014, a new peace paradigm is needed." And then Stewart continues with some other facts about the various peace proposals that Israel has offered to the Palestinians. That ties in with a recent story out of Israel in the past week that Ehud Olmert, who was the former prime minister of Israel, shared the maps that he offered in 2014. This is what, um, or maybe it was 2006 when he offered this plan to the Palestinians. In any case, it pretty much shows that everything the world is demanding right now, 1967 borders, the entire West Bank to the Palestinians, Gaza to the Palestinians. Ehud Olmert, as prime minister, offered this. He even offered a tunnel underground connecting Gaza and the West Bank so that there would be free transfer between those two areas, so that it would be a contiguous Palestinian state. It was, of course, rejected by the Palestinians, not surprisingly, because at the end of the day, any Palestinian leader who would agree to a two-state solution would immediately be killed by his own people. So that is why you will not see an agreement. That's why you will not see a two-state solution in the near future. But Stewart ended this letter saying the 350 who signed the ad in the New York Times must address these issues before giving advice to Israel. They certainly do not speak for me. So kudos to you, Stewart. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for sharing it with me, and thank you for writing that letter. All right, here's a letter, an email from Rena. I don't know where Rena is from. Rena writes, New York City has many tunnels under it, and it doesn't seem to collapse when there's construction above these tunnels. Did Gazan apartment buildings collapse as a result of all the tunnels under them? And will construction in Gaza truly be difficult because of the tunnels underneath? Or is that just an excuse that Israel is making? So, Rena, what I would say is that the engineering used in New York City to build subway trains and the Lincoln Tunnel, the Holland Tunnel, what have you, that type of technology is much more advanced than the technology being used in Gaza to build the tunnels underneath Gaza. And make no mistake about it, the tunnels under Gaza are extremely intricate. They are reinforced by concrete. They're wide enough for a truck to go through. But I do not believe that when these tunnels were constructed in Gaza, that there were engineers measuring the strength of the ground above it to see if it could hold buildings, to see if a new Gaza could be constructed over it. So that would be the difference. Is that when New York City was being built and these tunnels planned, that there really was engineering to make sure that what was on the top level of the ground, would be stable and would not collapse because of the tunnels beneath it. In Gaza, the main priority has been the building of tunnels, not whether reconstruction could happen above, not the buildings above. It's the tunnels themselves. And so I don't think there was much thought given to a next phase or construction that would happen later on. In any case, I truly believe that we cannot rebuild Gaza with so many tunnels underneath it. As the people who've researched the tunnel have said, there's a second Gaza underneath Gaza. So in a way, Gaza is hollow underneath what you're seeing. And the kind of reconstruction we need to house the 2 million Gazans who are there, who want to live there, I'm not sure that it could be supported given the extent of the tunnel network underneath. And that's why it might make sense to have those Gazans live elsewhere. Now, I'm not saying we should forcibly do that, but the idea of a 15 to 20-year reconstruction plan with 2 million people living in that area while it's happening, that doesn't sound very feasible. So we do need to consider other options. Shale writes, can you discuss the general Israeli reactions to President Trump's plans to send Gazans to Jordan and Egypt, along with plans to rebuild Gaza? Yeah, Israelis are, for the most part, at least in favor of entertaining the idea for the reasons I just laid out. It seems that Gaza is inhabitable while reconstruction is going on for 15 to 20 years. It also solves a problem that we've been dealing with pretty much since 2005, the idea of having an enemy state right next to us who's been hell bent on destroying us and using all funding they've been receiving to destroy us. So Israelis would be happy to have Gazans elsewhere. They're not really talking about ethnic cleansing and using terms like that. It's more just get this problem away from us, give us security, finally. We pulled out of Gaza in 2005 with the hope that Gazans would rebuild Gaza and live peacefully next to us. Instead, they used every dollar they received from countries around the world, including the US, your tax dollars, to build this tunnel network underneath. It's been revealed this past week that the October 7th attacks have been in the works, have been planned for the past 7 years. Israel totally missed it. But my point is that every ounce of brain power and money has been going to the tunnel networks and attacking Israel, to not to building a safe and habitable Gaza for the Gazans themselves. And so Israelis for the most part don't have a problem with the idea of the Gazans going elsewhere and turning Gaza into some sort of place that's at least built up and habitable, and not an enemy to us. Now, would it be President Trump's idea of a resort and a casino? I'm not so sure Israelis are in favor of that. I'm certainly not. But the idea of having the Gaza problem go away, that's appealing to all of us because they've been nothing. They've been murderous toward us since 2005 when we pulled out. Another question that Cheryl asks is, how does one respond to the number of Palestinian children who have been killed since the war began, when at the same time we are mourning the deaths of Kfir and Ariel Bibas, who were buried this past week? I think it's really a different. It's a difference in. There's an ethical difference here, Cheryl. Kfir and Ariel Bibas were brutally murdered by terrorists who entered Israel forcibly, breaking a ceasefire that existed in order to kill as many Israelis as possible. The Israeli army, when it's been attacking Gaza, is doing so with caution. We are taking precautions with, I guarantee you, a higher moral standard than any other army in the history of the world has ever fought. And when Palestinian children die in Gaza, it's collateral damage, often the result of Hamas using human shields to protect themselves. So all deaths are not equal. You do have to take into account the intention of those who are attacking. And in our case, we are attacking out of self defense. None of this would have happened had we not been attacked on October 7th. And if Hamas is going to use children as human shields, then children are going to die. So that is how I think we need to react, that it is too bad. It is not what we want. But at the same time, we're doing our best to avoid it, even though our enemy is actually trying to do their best to encourage as many children's deaths as possible because that makes them look good in the world media. That's why they're winning the PR war. A couple questions about Judaism in America. Leslie writes, I just listened to your podcast, What's Happening in Jewish America. I have a 30-year-old son and a 28-year-old daughter who love Israel, feel a strong sense of connection and Jewish identity, and they are involved Jewishly. Each attended regular school, Hebrew school, summer camp, were active in our conservative shul, active in Hillel and Chabad on college campus, and attended Birthright. Meanwhile, some kids I know who attended Jewish day school want nothing to do with Israel or being Jewish. I think for us, it was the combination of living Jewishly, not one single thing on its own. And yes, I agree with you, Leslie. It is never just one thing on its own. Day school is never the be all and end all solution to Jewish continuity. But I do think that families who tend to send their kids to Jewish day school tend to live more Jewish lives overall. So maybe it's a mixing of causes and hard to strain out cause and effect. But what I have found is that in general, kids who only attend Hebrew school but nothing else don't come out with much love for Jewish life, for Judaism, or a desire to continue living Jewish lives later on. That was my point. Your kids went to summer camp. I think that's a huge boost in addition to the Hebrew school they went to. You were active in the conservative shul. What I'm seeing here are a set of parents for whom Judaism really matters, and they were taking steps to instill that Judaism and love for Judaism in their kids. I don't see that in a lot of the families who send their kids to Hebrew school. I don't see that the families are actually attending synagogue themselves, are sending the kids to camp. Certainly some are, but those who are not, it's unlikely that the kids are going to come out with a strong love for Judaism. The family, the parents have to lead by example, and the parents have to be part of it. They cannot simply drop their kids off for Sunday school or for Shabbat services, junior congregation, and then drive to the mall, right? A question related to another question related to Judaism in America. Listening to your podcast today of your thoughts on Jews in the U.S., this is from Harriet. I agree with so much, and yet found some parts problematic. As a retired Jewish educator in the conservative, Reconstructionist, and Reform movements, your comments on Hebrew schools were especially painful. Hebrew schools educate by far more Jews in America than day schools with little money and, as you mentioned, inconvenient hours. The educators I knew took making the experience a meaningful one. They made it their mission, often with minimal support from the synagogues. Personally, I would not work in an institution that was not Zionist, although I know too well of their existence. In my own decades of work, Israel education was a very high priority. And I think the pain Harriet is feeling is that she dedicated herself to teaching Hebrew school, and her point is that so many more Jewish kids get their education from Hebrew school than Jewish day school. And so it was painful for her to hear me saying that Hebrew school is not effective. And in a way, Harriet, I feel like in your question, you revealed the answer that educators I knew took making this experience a mission of theirs to make it meaningful, often with minimal support from the synagogues. Well, isn't that the problem right there? That teachers Hebrew school teachers have to make this their mission on their own to make Hebrew school meaningful without the support of the synagogues themselves, without the support of parents and the rest of the synagogue community. I commend you for being a Hebrew school teacher, and I commend all the Hebrew school teachers out there. Your job is extremely difficult. You have kids coming who don't necessarily want to be there. The hours are inconvenient. It's extra after school, Sunday mornings, and you're taxed with trying to accomplish all of the Jewish education that these kids need. And as you said, often without the support of the synagogues themselves. Well, why is that? Why are synagogues not supporting you? Why are parents not supporting you? I think it's because for a lot of parents, they want the Hebrew school education to happen, but they don't want to make any effort themselves. That would be my guess. But I commend you for it, and I'm not putting you down, and I'm not putting Hebrew school down. I guess I'm just questioning how effective it's really going to be in the long run. I don't think Hebrew school is going to be effective in the long run when it comes to Jewish continuity. And I actually think it might turn off more kids than it turns on. An anonymous person wrote in, when my husband was interviewing for a job and we were considering relocating to a city in the southeastern US, I requested that he open the phone book when he came for his interview. Phone book. So this is obviously at least 30 years ago. And tell me how many synagogues were in the area. At the time, there were 4 synagogues and a Jewish community center and 1 Chabad. Now, our area has three Chabads and another being built. We also have two more in neighboring counties. We love the intimacy and the community that we have found at Chabad, and we were never able to find at the conservative or Orthodox synagogues that we had attended previously. And yeah, that's exactly what I talked about in last week's episode about Chabad. Chabad provides a personal experience. They make clear that they want you there for the Judaism. They want you there as they are. And I think Chabad trusts that if you have a good Jewish experience, you will donate. You will support them financially. And I've seen with synagogues, the model tends to be support us financially, and then you'll have a good experience. So I think Chabad is taking it the other way around, much more from a point of abundance as opposed to lack. And I think people notice that. They notice the personal touch. They notice the relationships you can have with the rabbi, the rebbitzin at Chabad, which is certainly different than you might feel in the big traditional suburban conservative or reform temples. And it's why I feel that Chabad is going to be in many ways the future of where Jews congregate in the US if you're not going to an Orthodox synagogue already. Now, a question about comedy. Donna writes in, are hecklers different in Israel than in the US, and how do you handle them? Wow, it's a great question. What I have found just from observing is that it's less about heckling in Israel. When I think of heckling, I think of an audience member calling out uninvited and sort of interrupting the show. That happens way more in the US. What I see in Israel is just the audience kind of in a friendly dialogue with the comedian, as if they're all friends, as if they're sitting around, and as if this were meant to be a discussion in the first place. So it's less about heckling and more about just a conversation that's interactive. And this goes back to what I said earlier about Israeli comedy, that living in Israel is very much a shared experience. So when the comedian starts talking about a certain topic, it's going to evoke emotions in his or her audience because we're all going through this experience together, whether it's driving on a certain road or starting school on September 1st or having family members in serving in the military in Gaza and in Lebanon. I've seen more than one comedian start his act recently by saying, I'm glad to be here. I just got out of Gaza, or I just got out of Lebanon. And the audience applauds wildly because we're both paying homage to his service and also because we know other people who are serving in those places. And so the heckling is less about interrupting the show and more about just getting into a dialogue with the comedian because we have this shared experience. Those are the questions for now. Please continue to write in. Answering your questions is what it really is my favorite part of this podcast, and I think so. It's what keeps it fresh and new week to week. So you can do that on joelchasnoff.com/podcast. Contact me there, or through my weekly newsletter that goes out on Thursday. Just reply to that with your question. I do want to briefly touch on where we stand right now here in Israel. And I will give you a spoiler alert. There's not really a clear answer here. We have officially finished the 42-day phase one of the ceasefire. So, what was supposed to happen is that during this ceasefire, we were supposed to start beginning negotiations on phase two, and phase two would mean the IDF would withdraw from portions of, well, really, the end of phase two would mean the IDF withdraws from all of Gaza, and all 59 of the remaining hostages would be released. Now, 59 hostages, only 24 of those are living, and two of those are actually not Israeli. So we're now talking about 22 living Israeli hostages in Gaza. So that's what phase two is supposed to be, that we'd start negotiating now, phase two. At the end of phase two, by the end of phase two, the IDF is out of Gaza and all hostages, living and dead, would be released. So that is actually not happening. We are not moving into phase two. The Israeli government announced that we are not moving forward with phase two as planned. This was very predictable to a lot of Israelis. We all kind of figured that Netanyahu would not let phase two take place. Instead, what Netanyahu is calling for is what he's calling the Witkoff plan. Although the U.S. has not officially said this is the Witkoff plan, the U.S. has said they support Netanyahu but are not referring to it as the Witkoff plan. So here is how the situation stands right now. What Netanyahu is hoping to do is to extend this ceasefire through the end of Ramadan and Passover. Ramadan is happening right now. Passover happens April 11th or 12th and ends April 19th. So the idea is that we would extend phase one of the ceasefire through April 19th. If Hamas were to approve this extension, what this extension calls for is that on day one of this new ceasefire, if it were approved tomorrow, this would mean that tomorrow, half of the hostages would be released, and the other half would be released on the final day of the ceasefire, assuming a permanent ceasefire has been agreed to. Israel has also decided to cut off all aid to Gaza until we get a satisfactory answer from Hamas about this new plan. So, again, the plan now is to extend phase one of the ceasefire. The minute Hamas accepts it, that would be day one. Half of the hostages would be released, the other half released on the final day at the end of Passover, at which point that would mean there had been an agreement for a permanent ceasefire and the IDF would withdraw from Gaza. However, Hamas has already rejected this as out of hand and as a deviation from the original agreed to ceasefire framework, which, let's be honest, it is. It is a deviation from the original plan. I'm going to try to break this down and tell you what I'm seeing here. First of all, like I said, most Israelis saw something like this coming. It was becoming clear that Netanyahu did not want to move into phase two. There's really no day after plan yet. And that's one of the major obstacles to moving forward with any kind of phase two is that Israel still hasn't offered any kind of viable plan for the day after. It also seems more and more clear to most Israelis that Netanyahu does not want all of the hostages out. And I personally believe that he does not want all of the hostages out because the minute all of the hostages are out, then we can open a state inquiry into what happened on October 7th, and he will be found at least partly responsible. We'll likely see the end of Netanyahu's reign if all the hostages were to come out. Netanyahu needs this war. He needs hostages in Gaza in order to remain a viable leader. And more, we're seeing allegations pile up against Netanyahu and his family. I'm just going to run through some of them right now. And the reason I'm telling you these is because with so many allegations right now on the table against the Netanyahus, it's becoming more and more obvious that once the hostages are out, he is done. So it turns out that the prime minister's office had intelligence about October 7th during the middle of the night between the 6th and the 7th. They had intelligence that Hamas was planning some sort of attack. However, they did not relay that intelligence to the prime minister himself. So there was a clear and obvious breakdown just in within the prime minister's office, which ultimately he's responsible for. 60% of Israelis believe there should be a state commission to examine how October 7th happened, and yet Netanyahu is refusing to call for such a state commission. because we know that he will be found at least partly responsible. There are more and more allegations that Netanyahu and his office have been taking money from Qatar in exchange for planting positive news stories about Qatar in the Israeli press. Now, let me just run that by you again. The Prime Minister of Israel has been receiving money from the Qatari government in exchange for planting positive stories about Qatar in the Israeli press. Qatar, which is home to the political bureau of Hamas, has been paying the prime minister's office. And these aren't wild allegations or conspiracy theory. This is an investigation that is now going on in Israel. That basically Netanyahu is being paid by the Qatari government. There have been allegations of the Netanyahu's carrying suitcases filled with cash to the US on their recent trips to the United States. Cash that wouldn't be examined by customs and that they could then bring into the US. There's also the idea that they are extremely, just excessively tone deaf as to what the mood of the country is. The other day was the funeral for Shiri and Ariel and Kfir Bibas, who in many ways were the faces of all the hostages, the two little redheaded boys, the mother. And it turned out it was the largest funeral procession in the history of Israel. More people turned out for the funeral than any other funeral in Israel's history, for more than for any government leader, more than for any rebbe. More people lined the streets, more, and this was all over the country. I took part in Ra'anana. More people were out with flags, were out saluting the convoy as it passed with the coffins than any other funeral in Israel. It was a huge day in Israel. It was a very sad day in Israel, the day of the burial of Shiri and her two boys. And yet, what did the prime minister do on that day? Well, first of all, his son, one of his sons, used that day to put up a social media post announcing his engagement to his longtime girlfriend. And his wife posted a picture on her social media, or his wife's makeup artist posted a picture on her social media of Sarah Netanyahu's new makeup job and haircut on the day of the Bibas funeral. And so there's just this feeling in Israel that the prime minister and his family are completely out of touch and almost literally living on a different planet than the rest of us. Now, I've hinted before that I'm not a Netanyahu fan, but I want to take this opportunity to really come out clear and state unequivocally that I despise him. I might lose listeners by saying this, but that is the truth. I cannot stand him. He is a narcissist, he is a criminal, and he is literally sacrificing the lives of soldiers, hostages, and Israeli civilians for his own political gain. And it's not just me who feels this. There is a large, large segment of the population that agrees with exactly what I'm saying right now. The problem is we feel a bit powerless because no matter how many rallies we attend, no matter how many protests we participate in, nothing changes. Bibi and his party loyalists just keep on keeping on. They keep on doing what they've been doing, calling for judicial reform, ignoring the calls of the public. Like I said, 60% of the public wants a state inquiry into how and why October 7th happened. That's legitimate. Today, Yardain Bibas joined the chorus of people calling for such an inquiry, and yet Bibi refuses. And it's becoming more and more obvious to the rest of us that Bibi needs these hostages as much as Hamas needs these hostages in Gaza. It's the only leverage that they have, both of them, to stay in power. So I do not expect the release of any more hostages soon, and most Israelis are very pessimistic about it because they know that Netanyahu is looking out for himself. Now, another interesting angle is that one of the hostages who was recently released, Eli Sharabi, I believe that's his name, gave a very powerful interview the other night on the Uvda program, which is like an up close and personal interview program, where he talked about what it was like to be a hostage in Gaza. And one of the main takeaways from that interview was that Hamas is watching the Israeli media very closely and that hostages would suffer based on what Israeli politicians would say, specifically Itamar Ben Gvir. So when Itamar Ben Gvir, who is the Minister of Defense and the prison system, when he would go on television in Israel and say, we are not allowing Palestinian prisoners to shower, well, then Hamas in Gaza would not allow Israeli hostages to shower. And when Itamar Ben Gvir would say that we are withholding food from Palestinian prisoners, Hamas would withhold food from Israeli hostages in Gaza. Not that Hamas were acting like angels until Itamar Ben Gvir opened his mouth. But the point is that the hostages, the Israeli hostages in Gaza, are suffering proportionally to how Israeli politicians speak in public. And Itamar Ben Gvir today said that he does not apologize for the suffering and torture that Eli Sharabi and other hostages endured because of what he said in public. He said, I'm proud of what I'm saying out loud, and I'll never cave in to what Hamas wants me to do. So there's just this ignorance on behalf of our leadership of the fact that we have real Israelis right now in Gaza who are being tortured and abused, and that part of the level of torture and abuse is directly connected to how Israeli politicians are speaking out loud here in Israel. The government just seems wildly out of touch with the majority of the Israeli population. They still have their loyalists, to be sure, the segments of the population that support them, but the vast majority of Israelis are ready for the hostages to come home, even if it means we withdraw from Gaza completely. We want a state inquiry, and our government is simply ignoring us. I would say that's where we stand, but does that even give you an accurate picture of where we stand? It sounds so vague. It sounds so messy. But the honest to God truth is I don't know what's going to happen next, and most of us don't. We're entering a very vague period with Ramadan and Passover. Anything could happen, but I personally do not expect more hostages to come home because you've got to want them to come home. It doesn't seem like those in power right now want them to. That wraps it up for this week's episode of Inside Israel, episode 72. Next week's live broadcast will be on March 9th, once again at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So March 9th, 1 p.m. Eastern, right here on YouTube Live. And I'll be talking about the IDF report that was issued this week. The IDF conducted its own investigation into its failures on October 7th and leading up to it. Pretty shocking. And next week, I'm going to break down that report for you. So again, 1 p.m. Eastern on March 9th. If you need the links and you're not already signed up for my newsletter, go on joelchasnoff.com, and there's a very clear box at the bottom where you can sign up for the weekly newsletter, Hebrew is Magic, and that will give you the links to the live broadcast. If you can't make this live broadcast, the video is posted within 24 hours on joelchasnoff.com/podcast, and you can always listen on Wednesdays. It drops on Apple and Spotify. And if you do listen there, please give a rating. It's the best way to help the podcast get out there. Thanks so much for joining. Those of you who are joining live right now, I look forward to seeing you next week. Keep your questions coming. Until then, Lehitraot, signing off from Ra'anana. I'm Joel Chasnoff.